Mrs Kittles and the Hat of Kindness. Have you ever seen a cat wearing a hat? The residents of the old house in the park certainly had, and she went by the name of Mrs Kittles. Mrs Kittles lived with her 2 children, Twinkle and Tabitha, in the old barn behind the house, which was nestled between the stables and the walled garden. She spent many a lazy day swatting flies into spiders' webs with her paw and chasing the birds that would come to the garden in search of fruit or seeds. She was a most beautiful cat with spots of black and orange over her soft white fur, and was always popular with visitors to the house due to her affectionate nature and the fact that she would reward a stroke or a scratch behind her ears by purring so loudly no one could hear themselves speak. The other point to note about Mrs Kittles was that for a cat, she had a keen eye for fashion and had observed the Scratton family's dress and was especially fond of the large decorative hats that Mrs Scratton and her daughters would wear on special occasions. These glorious confections were often adorned with all manner of ribbons and bows, shiny beads, and feathers so enormous that she often wondered how she would ever begin to chase the birds that they had once belonged to. She dreamed of one day having a hat of her own. How proud she would be to parade around the grounds in her finery each day. She didn't have to wait long for this dream to come true, as one morning, whilst passing the back door of the house, she spotted a pile of clothes in a sack ready to be collected by the rag merchant, and perched on top of the pile was a small, slightly battered straw hat, with a wide brim and trimmed with yellow satin ribbon. It was far too small for any of the family to have worn, but big enough to have once belonged to a doll, and quite perfect for a small cat. As quick as a flash, Mrs Kittles dashed through the open door, took hold of the brim of the hat in her mouth, and dashed back out again before anyone had time to notice it had gone. As she trotted back to the old barn, grinning from ear to ear, well, as much as she could with that small hat clamped firmly between her teeth, Mrs Kittles felt as though she would burst with joy. At last she had a hat, her very own hat, and she would wear it with style. After some personal additions, of course, as everyone knows that fashion is only as good as the imagination of the wearer. Back at the barn, Mrs Kittles placed her cat carefully on the hay-strewn floor and began to think about how she could embellish this thing of wonder to truly make it her own. "I need something shiny," she thought to herself, and she knew exactly who to go to see for that. Nudging the hat onto her head, which to her delight fitted perfectly, she made her way out into the walled garden. Horatio the magpie was perched in his usual spot at the far end of the garden, preening his feathers when Mrs Kittle approached. "Good morning, Horatio," she said cheerily. "It looks like it's going to be a lovely day today." The magpie fixed a beady eye on the cat, as he did not really trust a creature that made a habit of chasing birds, but he and Mrs Kittles had known each other for long enough now to form a friendship of sorts. "It will be a much nicer day if I can be left to arrange my feathers in peace," he replied somewhat snootily. Mrs Kittles knew exactly how to get this vain bird on her side, and proceeded to praise him on his remarkably fine appearance, and that it must have taken such skill and dexterity to arrange his feathers in such a way that every ray of sunshine hit each one in just the right spot to make them gleam so magnificently. It worked a treat, as she noticed that even though Horatio was still looking down his beak at her in the same snooty manner, his chest feathers were puffed out, and he'd adjusted his position so that the sun shone directly on his back for extra dazzling effect. "Oh, if only I could look as beautiful and shiny as you," she sighed. "But alas, as you will see, my new hat is in need of some decoration." And with this she did what only cats can, and peered up at the magpie from under its brim, her green eyes wide and sorrowful. Horatio, who had of course pretended not to have noticed Mrs Kittle's new hat, was still basking in the glow of her previous praise of him, and so could not fail to be moved by her plea. "Well," he said, "as you are aware, it is no easy task to look as good as I, but a mere trifle to make whatever that thing is on your head more acceptable to the eye." And with this he stared down his beak with a look of disgust, as if he had been presented with a rotten rat's tail. "Oh, Horatio," purred Mrs. Kittles, "I'd be most grateful if you could help me, as I have waited such a long time for the moment that I could possess my very own hat." The magpie cocked his head to one side and said, "Wait here." Then off he flew to his large nest of twigs set high up in the ancient oak tree. After what seemed like an age, out of the corner of her eye, Mrs. Kittles noticed a glint of light cutting through the blue, cloudless sky. And flying right behind that glint of light was Horatio, his beak stuffed with shiny trinkets that dazzled in the sunlight. He landed opposite Mrs. Kittles and dropped the trinkets to the floor in front of her. Her eyes lit up at the treasure before her. There was a large pearl button, a silver thimble, and a long ruby earring that glowed like a lantern. "Oh my goodness," she cried. "This will certainly make my hat a sight to behold. I am most grateful to you, dear Horatio." The bird glanced at the hat, and then at the trinkets, and said, "I have done what I can, the rest is up to you." And with this he flapped back onto the garden wall to resume his beauty regime. "Now," thought Mrs. Kittles, "I must stitch them to my hat." And off she went, back to the barn, carrying the trinkets in her mouth, careful not to drop the precious treasures, or even worse, swallow them. Of course, Mrs. Kittles was unable to stitch the trinkets to her hat, because we all know that cats are not, and never have been able to sew. But spiders can. And Mrs. Kittles was great friends with a pair of spiders that lived in the barn, and they certainly benefited from her favourite hobby of swatting flies into their webs. The spiders were more than happy to help Mrs. Kittles, and set about weaving and stitching their gossamer threads until all the trinkets were attached to the hat. They even created a tiny web in which to hold the thimble that danced around as Mrs. Kittles moved her head, which made her very happy indeed. "With such a beautiful hat," she declared, "I feel a walk in the park is required." And lifting her head high into the air, she trotted off into the park to show off her new creation. It wasn't long before she came across a family of mice scurrying around a log pile that had been left behind the stables. As you know, Mrs. Kittles had a fancy for chasing birds, but she'd always been rather fond of mice, in a friendly way of course, and so they had no fear of her and were quite happy to stop for a chat. "Hello there," she said. "You look busy on this fine day." The biggest mouse, who was obviously the head of the household, stopped for a moment, twitched her whiskers, and sat back on her hind legs to rest for a while. "Oh, Mrs. K, how nice to see you," she said, rubbing her back with her paws. "I can't stop to chat as we're moving house today, over to the other side of the park, near the bramble hedge, which has a lovely supply of berries for our larder. Oh, what a lovely hat you're wearing." Mrs. Kittles puffed up with pride. "Why, thank you," she replied. "It's my first day wearing it, and I'm glad you like it." The mouse smiled, gave a little sigh, and said wistfully, "Oh, it is the finest hat I have ever seen. I'd love a hat like that, but I'm sure I'll never be so lucky." Mrs. Kittles looked at the mouse, who was working so hard for her family, and a thought came to her. "Well," she said, "I would like to give you a house-moving gift." And with this, she wiggled her head, and the silver thimble attached to her hat danced and sparkled. "Do you see this lovely silver thimble? Please accept it as my gift to you, and I think this would make a delightful hat. As you will see, it has a beautiful spider-crafted gossamer lace cover and ties, and is truly a one-of-a-kind piece." The mouse's eyes glistened with tears of gratitude. "Oh, you are so kind," she gulped as she removed the thimble from the hat and tied it onto her own head. "You look positively perfect," said Mrs. Kittles, "and now you have your very own hat for special occasions." And after exchanging a fond goodbye, the creatures went their separate ways, both wearing a hat and a huge smile. Mrs. Kittles felt a warm glow as she continued her walk, and it was not just from the sun's rays, but a feeling deep inside that she'd made another creature's life that bit happier. As she passed by the small lake where Geoffrey and Humphrey liked to spend the occasional lazy afternoon fishing, she heard familiar quacking noises coming from the duck house at the edge of the water, and it sounded like Mr. and Mrs. Cooldrake were at home. "Hello there," she called over to them, and swimming across the lake came the ducks, followed by a small but very noisy flock of ducklings. Good day to you, Mrs. Kittles," called Mr. Cooldrake. "I trust you are well, and I must say it is rather a magnificent hat you're sporting, and most flattering, if I may be so bold." If cats were able to blush, then Mrs. Kittles' fur would have turned crimson, but instead she lowered her head demurely and thanked him most gratefully for his kind words. How are the children, Mrs. Cooldrake?" she asked, swiftly diverting the attention away from herself. "Oh, they are thriving, my dear," replied Mrs. Cooldrake, "although a little too adventurous for my liking," she added as she struggled to drag one of the ducklings away from the reeds. "Yes," agreed Mr. Cooldrake, "and as for calling them home for bedtime, impossible! They just want to be out playing all day." A thought flashed across Mrs. Kittle's mind, and she moved closer to the edge of the water. "They need a distraction," she said, "and I have the very thing here on my hat." She indicated to the ruby earring, which was reflecting the afternoon light and glowing as red as the sunset. "Take this jewel and hold it up to the light whenever you want the children to return home. They will see it glow and want to follow it." Mr. and Mrs. Cooldrake were overjoyed with the gift and thanked the cat for her kindness. As she walked away, Mrs. Kittles looked back and spotted Mrs. Cooldrake holding the ruby earring aloft, closely followed by the eager and inquisitive ducklings. "I've had such a lovely walk today," mused Mrs. Kittles, "but I must head home now and see what those two children of mine have been up to all day." And she made her way back to the barn, the glow inside her burning even brighter now. As she approached the house, she noticed Mr. Bravo, the Scratton's horse, was standing outside the bay window, looking splendid in his bridle and harness, ready to pull the family's carriage and take them into town. As she got closer, she saw that part of the bridle appeared loose, and Mr. Bravo looked most uncomfortable. "Hello there, Mr. Bravo," she said brightly. "Where are you taking the family today?" Mr. Bravo turned and looked down at the little cat standing before him, proudly sporting a slightly battered and by now partially decorated hat, and said slowly, "Absolutely nowhere until they can fix this blooming contraption," and shook his head, causing the bridle to jangle and rattle around. "They'll be late for their appointment if they don't hurry up." Oh dear, cried Mrs. Kittles. "That will never do. What's the matter with your bridle, Mr. Bravo?" she queried. "Well, one of these there shiny button thingies has worked itself loose, fell off, and now no one can find it," he replied. "A button," she thought. "If only I had—" "A button!" she exclaimed, making the horse jolt with the force of her outburst. "Mr. Bravo, I have a button sewn onto my hat. Quickly now, remove it using your teeth, drop it in front of you, and I'll do the rest." The horse looked somewhat bemused, but went ahead and took the button from the hat. There was a worrying moment when she saw Mr. Bravo's big teeth coming towards her that Mrs. Kittles feared he'd bite her head clean off, but he quite daintily nipped the button off the hat and dropped it to the floor. Mrs. Kittles then started to meow continuously and loudly outside the front door, causing such a racket that Dorothy came rushing out to see what was causing such a commotion. As she reached the front door, the noise had stopped, and the cat was nowhere to be seen. But on the ground in front of Mr. Bravo lay a large pearl button. A button that was the ideal replacement for the one lost from the horse's bridle. And without further ado, Dorothy retrieved her sewing kit from the parlour and stitched the button onto the bridle with the very strongest thread she could find. "How mysterious that this button should appear today, just when we thought we wouldn't be able to get into town. What a marvellous stroke of luck," she said aloud, and skipped back inside to inform the family that they would have their trip after all. In her hiding place amongst the wisteria, Mrs. Kittles watched the scene unfold, and again felt the familiar warm glow of satisfaction in having helped. Unseen, she sneaked back to the barn where her children and Horatio the magpie were waiting. "We hear you've had quite the adventure today, Mother," said Tabitha, giving the older cat an affectionate lick on the face. "I certainly have, but my poor hat hasn't, I'm afraid," she said, as she removed the hat and placed it on the floor of the barn, where all that remained of its former glory was the yellow ribbon. The magpie strutted forward and placed something round and shiny onto the brim of the hat. "I heard about your kind deeds today, and one kind deed deserves another, so this is my gift to you. And this gift will continue to do good without you even realizing it," he said mysteriously before flying off to his nest to settle for the night. "How strange," said Mrs. Kittles, "but how lovely, and I shall ask the spiders to sew my new shiny treasure onto my hat first thing tomorrow. Oh, but now I'm very tired and ready for bed." And she settled down amongst the warm, fragrant hay and fell asleep. But what of the shiny treasure, I hear you ask? Well, it certainly lived up to its promise to continue to do good deeds, as it was in fact a little brass bell. So whenever Mrs. Kittles felt the urge to chase birds, they could always hear her coming.